she had one road out and one season to take it, and she had already missed two. Felicity Crane had been 23 years old when she married Harwick Dole, and she had been 26 years old when she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after a person has exhausted every other explanation, that she was not going to survive him, not in the way people use that word loosely, not survive in the sense of endure and carry on, survive in the original literal sense, the one that involved a pulse. Harwick Dole owned the eastern third of Garnet County, Wyoming, which in 1887 meant he owned the water rights, the grazing leases, the sheriff's salary in practice if not on paper, and the silence of every man, woman, and preacher between the Rattlesnake Creek and the high timber above Sutter's Gap. He was 44 years old, and he had the kind of face that photographers liked, square-jawed and composed, the face of a man who knew how to present himself to a camera because he had practiced it. He had courted Felicity with that face for 6 months before the wedding and shown her the other one 3 weeks after. The town of Garnet Crossing knew. The way small towns always know, which is to say completely in every particular, and with a collective precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so useless. They knew because Felicity had come into Alderman's dry goods on a Tuesday in February with her left eye swollen to the color of a ripe plum and a story about a barn door that nobody believed and nobody challenged. They knew because Doc Hennessy had set her wrist in the spring of the second year and written nothing in his ledger about how it came to be broken. They knew because Harwick Dole paid the bill for the doctor, and the bill for the lumber, and the bill for the new school roof, and the bill for half the mortgages in the county, and knowing cost more than the people of Garnet Crossing were willing to spend. Felicity had stopped expecting otherwise somewhere in the middle of the second year. Expectation was an expense she couldn't afford. What she could afford, or what she had managed to accumulate in the way that people with no good options accumulate the one resource still available to them, was money. Not much. $1 here taken from the household envelope when Harwick left the count loose, 75 cents there from selling preserves at the church sale and listing the amount in the household record as 50 cents. $3 saved from the egg money over 6 weeks, hidden in a folded piece of oilcloth inside the lining of her winter coat, which Harwick never touched because he found domestic things beneath his notice. She had $142.30. It had taken her 19 months. She was counting it for the third time on the morning the drifter rode into town, sitting at the kitchen table while the bread baked and the house was empty, her hands moving over the bills with the precise memorized efficiency of a woman who had nothing else she could call entirely her own. She heard him before she saw him, not him specifically, but the sound of a horse moving slowly up the main street of Garnet Crossing, which was a sound she had learned to separate from wagon traffic and the ranchers' horses and the particular rhythm of Harwick's black gelding, because listening carefully to approaching sounds was something she had trained herself to do over 3 years, the way you train yourself to do things that keep you alive. This sound was different, unhurried in a way that wasn't laziness, the sound of something that had come a long way and wasn't trying to be anything about it. She folded the money back into the oilcloth and put it where it lived and went back to the bread. She met him 4 days later at Alderman's. His name was Tatum Briggs, and he had come down from the high country above Sutter's Gap, where he had been running a trap line for the better part of 2 years. He was 31 or 32, she estimated, with the particular weathering of men who spent most of their time above the tree line, dark from sun and wind rather than complexion, with a stillness to him that she noticed immediately because it was the opposite of the kind of stillness she had learned to fear. Harwick's stillness was the stillness of a man choosing his moment. This was something else, the stillness of a man who simply didn't need to fill the air with himself. Felicity was at the counter when he came in. She was buying thread, which was a permitted errand, one of the few. Harwick's sister Margot ran the list of permitted errands, the way she ran most things in the Dole household, which was to say with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had decided that control was the same thing as care, and had spent 30 years making that case to everyone around her. Margot Dole was 57 years old and had never married, and had lived in her brother's house for 11 of those years, first under their father and then under Harwick, and she had learned somewhere along the way to explain every act of cruelty as an act of prudence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had a way of framing things, the particular vocabulary of a woman who had survived by making herself useful to powerful men, that made Felicity question her own perceptions at the cellular level. Margot never said anything was Felicity's fault. She just found ways to explain why it had been inevitable. She was the more dangerous of the two, and Felicity had understood this for almost a year. At Alderman's, the drifter bought salt lamp oil, a box of .44 cartridges, and a length of rope. He did it without conversation, which was unusual enough in Garnet Crossing that old Pete Alderman watched him with the faint disturbance of a man witnessing something he can't categorize. He held the door for Felicity on her way out. That was all. He didn't speak, didn't do anything that could be characterized as more than basic courtesy. But he looked at her the way she had not been looked at in 3 years, which was to say directly, and without the particular quality of avoidance she had come to recognize in every face in Garnet Crossing, that careful redirection of the eyes that meant they knew and had chosen not to, which was its own kind of indictment. He just looked at her, like she was a person standing in a doorway, like that was the entire and sufficient fact of the situation. She went out to the buckboard and drove home and put the thread in Margot's sewing box and said nothing about any of it. Harwick found the oilcloth 3 days later. Not all of it. She had moved the main portion to the gap behind the root cellar shelving 6 months ago, when she had begun to understand that he was getting suspicious of how long her errands took. What he found was the emergency cash, $30 she had kept in the coat lining, in case she needed to move fast and didn't have time to get to the root cellar. He came to her in the kitchen with the bills in his hand, and his face in the configuration she had learned to dread most, which was the calm one. Harwick at his most dangerous was never loud. Loud was for men who needed theater. Harwick was precise. "You've been keeping money from me," he said. It wasn't an accusation in tone. It was an observation, delivered in the voice of a man noting a fact about the weather. She had a story prepared. She had several stories prepared, always, for different amounts and different circumstances, because preparation was the primary tool available to her, and she had sharpened it until it was the only thing about her life that felt anything like competence. The story was about a broken piece on the butter churn she hadn't wanted to bother him with. "Small expense," she said. "I didn't want to trouble you." Harwick looked at her for a long time. He had a way of looking that was different from most people's looking, more like an assessment, like he was checking dimensions against a blueprint he carried internally. She held very still under it. She had learned that stillness was always better than movement when he was doing this. He put the money on the table. "It's $32, he said. "28, she said. "I miscounted at first." He looked at the bills. He looked at her. The kitchen clock ticked. "Margot makes the household purchases," he said finally. "You know that, I know. It was a small thing, I should have told her." A pause. She watched him decide something. He folded the bills and put them in his vest pocket, and she watched $30 disappear and kept her face perfectly still and calculated the remaining $112.30 behind the root cellar shelving and in the hem of her second dress. What came after lasted about 20 minutes and left her with 2 cracked ribs and a resolution. She didn't have time anymore. She had believed she had more time. She had been wrong about that before, and this was the last time she could afford to be wrong about it. She went back to Alderman's 2 days later on the pretense of an exchange, which was permitted. Margot had bought the wrong size hook for the parlor curtains. Tatum Briggs was at the counter when she came in, buying more salt. He turned when she entered, the same brief direct look as before, and she crossed to the counter and put the hook on the wood surface and said, in a voice she made as even as she could make it, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to not make anything of it in front of Pete." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the counter and said, in a tone that engaged with nothing in particular, "Pete, I think I need another pound of that salt." It was short wait. Old Pete went to the back room. She had about 45 seconds. She said, "I need to get to Hollowell. That's the county seat north of here, across the county line. I have money. I have a horse I can take without it being noticed until morning. I need to know if there's a trail through the high country that doesn't come back through town." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the wall of goods behind the counter. She watched his face and couldn't read it, and decided that was probably fine, that a man whose face she couldn't read was not automatically a man whose answer she needed to fear. "Through Sutter's Gap," he said. "Take the creek trail north past the mill. Follow the creek until it forks. Go left at the fork and up. There's a trapper's line camp about 6 miles up. You'd need to rest the horse there. After that, it's another 12 miles to the divide. From the divide you can see Hollowell in the valley." She had memorized it by the time Pete came back with the salt. Briggs paid for the salt. He didn't look at her again before he left. She exchanged the hook for the correct size and drove home. She left on a Thursday 3 nights later, at 2 in the morning. The night was clear and cold, with the particular high country cold that came down off the peaks in late September and reminded you that the mountains didn't have an opinion about whether you made it. She had the money from behind the root cellar shelving and from the dress hem, $112.30, wrapped in the oilcloth and distributed between her coat, her left boot, and a small leather bag inside her saddlebag, where it would be the last thing found if someone searched from the outside. She had Harwick's second rifle, the one kept in the barn, because the one in the house was too close to where he slept. She had taken it down from the barn wall 3 weeks ago and propped it in the back corner of the feed room, behind 2 bales of straw, so that when she needed it, it would simply be there, waiting, without the noise of moving it in the night. She had planned this the way she had learned to plan everything, in pieces, over time, with patience, and without the luxury of anyone to consult. The mare was Opal, a gray 6-year-old she had been permitted to ride for errands, because Opal was considered too small for ranch work, and Harwick had always measured things by whether they were useful to him. She saddled Opal in the dark without a lamp. Her hands shook for the first 5 minutes and then stopped, which was something she had noticed before about herself under pressure, that the shaking was the announcement and not the event, that her hands stopped when the thing that needed doing actually began. She led Opal out of the barn and down the side of the yard away from the house, through the gap in the fence she had oiled 3 days ago so it wouldn't catch. She mounted at the road and turned north. The mill was 2 miles out. The creek fork was another mile past that. She made it to the fork in just over an hour, moving carefully in the dark, with the trees closed in on both sides and the creek sound beside her to keep direction. At the fork she turned left and the trail began to climb, and Opal's breathing changed to the measured effort of a horse working uphill. And Felicity leaned forward in the saddle and let her work, and tried not to think about the house behind her and the man in it who would not find the bed empty until 5 in the morning, when he usually woke, which gave her 3 hours. 3 hours was enough. She had calculated it 11 times. The line camp appeared out of the dark at what she estimated was 4 in the morning, a low structure of stacked logs against a rock face with a cold fire ring in front of it. She almost missed it. She saw it because a horse moved in the dark beyond it, shifting weight in its sleep, and the sound was different from wind. She stopped Opal. She sat very still and listened. From inside the structure, someone said, in a voice that was low and entirely without alarm, "Trail goes easier if you rest the horse here. Creek's 20 yards east for water." She had not made a sound. She had no idea how he had known she was there. She got down from Opal and led her to the creek. Tatum Briggs built a fire small enough to be invisible from below and made coffee and didn't ask her anything. She sat across the fire from him, with the rifle across her knees, and drank the coffee, and watched the tree line below them, and listened and heard nothing except the ordinary sounds of a mountain at 4 in the morning. "You were waiting," she said. He turned his cup in his hands. He had a way of thinking before he spoke that she had already come to recognize, even from a single conversation, the particular quality of a man who said things because they were true, rather than because they filled the silence. "Figured you might come through," he said. Didn't know when. She looked at the fire. She thought about Margot in the morning, Margot's face when she found the bed empty, the specific quality of Margot's efficiency when she had something to organize, which was how she would treat this, as a problem requiring organization and the restoration of a correct arrangement. "She'll tell him I went north," Felicity said. "Margot, she knows I have no family south or west. She knows every road, she'll tell him north." Briggs nodded once. "How many men does he keep?" 4 on the property. 2 of them will ride for him if he asks. The other 2 are hired hands who are afraid of him but not loyal to him. "There's a difference. How do you know that?" She looked at him across the fire. She had not told him anything except a trail question and a destination. She was trying to determine how much he knew, and from what source, because the source mattered, and because she had learned over 3 years to never take the face of information at face value. "Pete Alderman talks when he's stacking shelves," Briggs said. "And there's a man named Vickers who shoes horses for the Dole Ranch and comes up to my camp sometimes in the fall to trade for pelts. He doesn't talk about the ranch much, but what he doesn't say is sometimes as plain as what he does." She absorbed this. It was the same mechanism Harwick used in reverse, reading silences, reading what people withheld. She had spent 3 years becoming very good at exactly this, and here was a man who did it without apparent effort, and apparently for no particular purpose except that he paid attention. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Not at the camp. Here specifically, at this hour, with coffee made." He was quiet for a moment. A log in the fire shifted. Above them, the sky had begun its first very faint lightning at the east edge, not yet dawn, but the announcement of it. "Because Vickers told me 6 weeks ago that Dole had been asking about stages going north," he said. "Not for himself. He was asking which ones could be tracked and which ones couldn't. And a man who asks that question about northbound stages when he has a wife and a sister-in-law and no reason to go north himself is asking because he's planning to need to know." She sat with that. The coffee was hot and real, the kind of thing that becomes briefly very important at 4 in the morning on a mountainside when you are trying to hold your thinking together. "He was planning for when I ran," she said, or planning to make sure you didn't get far if you did. She looked at the fire. She thought about the $30 in the vest pocket. She thought about the question she had never let herself ask directly. Whether Harwick wanted her gone, or wanted to be the one to decide the terms of her going. Whether there was a version of this where she simply leaving wasn't sufficient, where the leaving itself needed to be controlled as everything else had been controlled. She thought about a man asking which northbound stages could be tracked.
"We need to move before light," she said. He was already putting out the fire.
The trail above the line camp was steeper than anything below it, and by the time they reached the divide 4 hours later, Opal was blowing hard in Felicity's ribs, which had been broken and had healed improperly and gave her trouble on cold mornings, had been giving her trouble for the last 2 hours, without her saying anything about it. From the divide the valley below was visible, exactly as Briggs had said it would be. Hollowell was a scatter of dark shapes against brown grass, smaller than Garnet Crossing, but it had a land office and a telegraph and a different county sheriff, none of which Garnet Crossing had in any form that mattered to her. She stood at the divide and looked at it, and felt something she couldn't name for a moment, and then named it as relief, which was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected something more complicated, and it turned out that simple relief was the thing available to her, which was fine. She would take it. They came down off the divide in the early afternoon and reached Hollowell's Main Street before the general store closed. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Pruitt. She found this out because his name was on a sign outside the office, which was the first indication she had encountered in 3 years of a law enforcement officer who wanted to be identified. He was a compact man in his 50s with the direct manner of someone who had learned to cut to the situation quickly and didn't have much patience for the kind of performance that's substituted for substance.
She told him a specific and accurate account of 3 years in a Garnet County household, the names, the dates she could remember, the doctor's visit that was in his ledger if anyone looked, the wrist, the ribs.
She told it the way she had rehearsed telling it,
with no ornamentation,
because she had learned that ornamentation was a thing people used to explain themselves to audiences they didn't trust, and she had decided, watching Aldous Pruitt's face, that she would trust him provisionally and see what he did with it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man thinking, rather than a man performing consideration.
"Dole has no standing in this county," he said. "His money doesn't cross the county line in any official capacity." He looked at her. "That doesn't mean he won't come. It means when he does, he'll be on my ground instead of his." She understood the distinction. "I'll be staying," she said. "I have money. I need work."
He told her the hotel took on laundry help Thursdays, and the land office needed a clerk who could read figures, both of which she could do. Harwick Dole came to Hollowell on the 6th day. He came with the 2 loyal men and without the sheriff, which meant he had made a calculation about what was legal and what was possible, and had decided to bet on possible. He was composed when he arrived, the public face fully assembled, the reasonable man, the concerned husband, the property owner whose property had been, in his framing, confused about where it belonged. Felicity was at the land office when someone came to the door and told her she had the rifle.
She had kept it close for 6 days because she had known this was coming, and had decided 6 days ago that
knowing it was coming was the thing that made it different from the previous 3 years.
She went to the street. Harwick saw her from across it.
He was still on his horse, and she watched his face do the thing she had watched it do 100 times.
That rapid calibration, the reading of the room,
the assessment of who was watching and what version of himself they required. The room was the main street of Hollowell, Wyoming, in October. The audience was everyone on it. She walked toward him, and she felt the difference between this street and every street she had walked in Garnet Crossing. Nobody here looked away. Nobody found something urgent to do in the back room. They watched with the frank attention of people who had no particular stake in the outcome, and therefore no reason to perform ignorance. Harwick swung down from his horse.
"Come home," he said. He used the quiet voice, the almost reasonable one, the one that had cost her the first year.
She stopped 8 feet from him.
"I don't live there anymore," she said.
He took a step toward her. One of his men moved to the left. She noticed this without moving her head, the way she had learned to notice things in her peripheral field, because looking at them directly was a form of information she couldn't afford to give. From behind her and to the right, from the direction of the sheriff's office, she heard Aldous Pruitt say, in the tone of a man describing a fact about the geography, "Garnet County ends at the divide, Mr. Dole. You're a private citizen here, same as anybody." Harwick looked past her at Pruitt. She watched him do the rapid calculation she had seen him do 100 times. This was different from the store with Dole's hired men and his purchased sheriff.
This was a street where he was nobody's creditor and nobody's employer and nobody owed him anything. She raised the rifle.
Not at him.
She brought it to carry position across her chest.
The way you carry a rifle when you want a man to understand you know how to hold one.
His face changed. The composed exterior didn't collapse. That wasn't Harwick's way, but something behind it shifted. A readjustment.
The expression of a man who has encountered terrain he didn't map in advance and is deciding what it costs him. She watched him arrive at the calculation, and she watched it arrive at an answer he didn't like.
Felicity, he said. His voice was still controlled, still almost reasonable.
Harwick, she said, and she used his name the way she had not used it in 3 years, without the careful managing tone, without the monitoring of her own inflection for anything that might make the ride home longer. She used it like it was just a name, and he was just a man on a street.
I know every version of that voice, she said. I spent 3 years learning them. You've got the reasonable one out right now, the one you use when there are people watching, and I know what comes after it when they stop watching, and there aren't going to be years of that anymore. She heard the street. She heard it the way you hear a room when it goes quiet in a specific way. These men with you, she said, they know what they rode into town for. They can go back and tell whoever asks that you came, and it didn't take. That's what happened here. That's the whole of it.
One of the men shifted his horse.
She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Harwick's face. His jaw moved. She recognized the specific way it moved. She had studied his face the way you study a language you didn't choose to learn, because survival required it. Then he did something she had not planned for, which was that he laughed.
It was short and flat, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to express amusement. You think this is finished, he said. I think you're in the wrong county with no sheriff and no paper on me, and 6 witnesses, she said.
And I think whatever you came here to do, you decided it costs more than it's worth. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt. Then he looked at the street, at the people on it. He put his foot in the stirrup and got back on his horse.
She stood and watched him. He looked at her once more from the height of the horse, and she kept her face still and looked back with the same direct attention she had been practicing for 6 days, the particular steadiness of a woman who has nothing left to manage and can finally just look. He turned the horse. He rode back the way he'd come, and his men followed, and she stood on the street of Hollowell and held the rifle across her chest and watched them go. Watched them get smaller, and then smaller still, and then pass out of sight around the bend where the road climbed back toward the divide.
Aldous Pruitt came to stand beside her. He'll try something else, the sheriff said. Men like that don't stop, they just change the angle. I know, she said, but he'll do it from Garnet County, and I'll see it coming from here.
Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his office. Tatum Briggs was leaning against the wall of the land office, where he had been for the past 20 minutes, which she had known because she had counted on it, without letting herself articulate why. He had come down off the mountain and had not made any declaration about it. He was simply present, the way he had been present at the line camp with coffee made at 4 a.m. The way she was beginning to understand was simply who he was. She walked over to him. She put the rifle under her arm.
Thank you, she said. For the trail. For the camp.
He looked at the road where Harwick had been. He had an expression she was still learning to read, not because it was complicated, but because she was not accustomed to faces that showed exactly what they contained and nothing else.
You did the walking,
he said.
She looked at the divide, the ridge line visible above the town from here, the pale October sky behind it.
I want to know what's on the other side of that, she said. She was not talking about Garnet County. She was talking about the ridge that ran north of Hollowell, the country beyond it she had seen from the trail coming down, the green valley and the timber and the long distance of it.
Oregon Territory, eventually, he said. If you follow the watershed down, she had heard that word the same way she had heard very few words in 3 years.
Like something that had a future tense. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the road. She thought about $112.30 and a horse and a rifle and whatever came next, which was not a thing she had ever been permitted to think about in 3 years, and which therefore required entirely new equipment, new vocabulary, new ways of understanding what she was allowed to want. She was 26 years old. She had most of a life ahead of her, and the first real choice about what to do with it. She kept looking north.